Afternoon, everyone. Just so you know, we're getting more chairs for those of you coming in. We're moving some tables, and I guess we didn't expect such a big crowd, though we should have, since I think Dr. Offit has been in the news quite a bit recently and as of late, and has some fans and has some people that I wouldn't quite qualify as fans. But by way of introduction, my name is Lynn Markey, and I'm here on behalf of the Coalition for the Life Sciences. The Coalition for the Life Sciences together sponsors these briefings with the Congressional Biomedical Research Caucus. The caucus is chaired by Congressman Rush Holt from New Jersey, Congresswoman Lois Capps from California, Congressman Brian Bilbray from California, and Congressman Mike Castle from Delaware. We do about 12 of these a year. Our next one is going to be July 9th, but I thank you for being here today. Let me introduce a little bit about Paul Offit. He is an internationally known expert on vaccines, immunology, and virology. He is the chief of the Division of Infectious Disease and the director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He is a Maurice Hillman Professor of Vaccinology and Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also a member of the Center of Disease Control's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. He has published more than 120 papers in medical and scientific journals in the area of rotavirus-specific immune response and vaccine safety. And he is the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine recently recommended for universal use in infants by the CDC. As I mentioned earlier, he is in the unenviable position of being in the center of a very emotional debate about the dangers of vaccines in children. Many of you may be here today because you strongly disagree with his findings. I know that we are always courteous and respectful regardless of our strong feelings on any issues. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Offit. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to the Congressional Biomedical Research Caucus. What I thought I would do today, and I think I can do this we'll do this in less than 25 minutes, is to go through the science that has evaluated whether or not vaccines cause autism, and then talk about ways that I think people in the media or parent advocacy groups have tried to either defeat or diminish that science. Oops, sorry. So the first hypothesis that was brought up as how vaccines could cause autism was brought up by a British researcher in 1998 in a paper that was published in The Lancet. And his name was Andrew Wakefield. He was a gastroenterologist that worked at the Royal Free Hospital in London, a prestigious hospital. And he published this paper in a prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, which was titled Ileal Lymphoid Nodular Hyperplasia, Nonspecific Colitis, and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children. Dr. Wakefield's hypothesis was that this vaccine, this combination of three vaccines, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, induced a series of events that included first disrupting the intestinal mucosal surface, which caused a loss of intestinal barrier function, and then entrance into the bloodstream of encephalopathic proteins, meaning proteins that could damage the brain, and then subsequent development of autism. His study design included 12 children, 8 of whom had autism, in the United Kingdom, who had, in the month before the first developing symptoms of autism, received this MMR vaccine. Now, the problem with this paper is it really wasn't a study. Dr. Wakefield didn't study anything. What he did was he just published a series of cases of children who'd received MMR vaccine and then developed symptoms of autism. One cannot establish a causal link between receipt of a vaccine and the onset of autism without a control group. And by that I mean, when you're trying to determine whether or not, in this case, the MMR vaccine caused autism, you need 4 pieces of information. You need to know the incidence of the disease in a vaccinated group, which means those who did and didn't get that disorder after receiving vaccine. And then you need to know the incidence of a disease in a non-vaccinated group, meaning those who did or didn't get that disease if you didn't get the vaccine. So that really requires 4 pieces of information. What Dr. Wakefield provided in his paper was just box A. And to his credit, actually, in the discussion section of that paper, he said, I cannot say whether or not MMR vaccine causes autism absent a control group. Unfortunately, it was the last time he ever said it. When the cameras and the lights went on, that's all he said. Now the way that one answers this question is is by epidemiological studies. And by that, what I mean is you look at hundreds of thousands of children who did receive the MMR vaccine, compare them to hundreds of thousands of children who didn't receive the MMR vaccine, and then look at the risk of autism between those two groups. If the risk is statistically significantly greater in the group that received the vaccine as compared to the group that didn't receive the vaccine, then one can say that MMR may possibly be a contributing factor in autism. Now, that study has been done 10 times. It's been shown on these two slides. This is the first and this is the second slide. It's been done by researchers in the United States, in Canada, in England, in Denmark, and they have all found the same thing. In a very clear and consistent and reproducible way, the incidence of autism in an MMR vaccinated group is no different than a group that didn't receive the vaccine. Then the hypothesis shifted. So this was Wakefield first brought up his hypothesis in 1998. In the year 2000, largely spurred by a parent advocacy group called Safe Minds, there was raised the notion that thimerosal, an ethyl mercury-containing preservative that was found in several vaccines that were used in this country, might in fact cause autism. And again, the way that one answers that question is by doing an epidemiological study. Look at hundreds of thousands of children who receive thimerosal-containing vaccines, compare them to hundreds of thousands of children who receive the same vaccines that were thimerosal-free, and see whether or not thimerosal increased one's risk of having the diagnosis of autism. This was done in 6 separate studies. There's a 7th study that's being done by the CDC, the results of which will probably be reported next year. These studies were done again in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Denmark, and again, in a very clear and consistent way. There was no increased risk in the diagnosis of autism if you'd received thimerosal-containing vaccines than if you hadn't. So what are the ways in which one tries to defeat that science? And there's a few of them, and I'm going to go through them one by one. The first is that people would argue that epidemiological studies cannot detect rare events, that they're only so sensitive. And the quote that you often hear, and this actually, there was a Time magazine article just a few weeks ago, the cover of which actually included a child getting a vaccine with the title The Truth About Vaccines. It was written by Alice Park. And at the end of that article included essentially this sentence: vaccines might cause autism in a small group of genetically susceptible individuals. Is there that rare group that we're missing in these epidemiological studies? Now, epidemiological studies are actually quite powerful, and I'm going to give you a series of examples. There was an outbreak of influenza in Fort Dix, New Jersey, at an Army base in 1976. Some of you probably remember this well. The fear with that outbreak was that this signaled the start of an influenza pandemic. The virus that was circulating among these recruits, and it killed one recruit, was a strain of influenza that had actually been derived from a pig, and that this particular vaccine was called the swine flu vaccine. It was administered to 40 million Americans in 1976, and here's one of them. And it was found to be a rare cause of a disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an ascending paralysis, sort of starting with the legs and working its way up. It can affect the muscles of respiration, and it can require a ventilation, meaning external breathing device. It's a serious disorder, and it was found to occur in 1 per 100,000 people that received that vaccine. That means that of the 40 million people that got that vaccine, 400 developed Guillain-Barré syndrome. There was a vaccine that was released in this country in 1998 to prevent a disease, rotavirus. The vaccine was made by Wyeth. It was called RotaShield. It was distributed to about 1 million children in the United States and found to be a very rare cause of intestinal blockage called intussusception. That occurred in roughly 1 per 10,000 children, or affected essentially 100 children in this country, 100, and was easily picked up in a retrospective epidemiological analysis. There's also measles-containing vaccines are found to be a very rare cause of something called thrombocytopenia, which is a lowering of the platelet count. Platelets are the cells in our body that we use in part to help clot our blood. That probably affects less than 100 children every year in the United States, easily picked up in a retrospective analysis. So when you have right now the omnibus autism proceeding, which is a group of parents of 5,000 children who are claiming that vaccines caused their child's autism and are now going to the federal government for compensation, that would be, if that were true, if these 5,000 parents are correct, that would be easily picked up in a retrospective analysis. In fact, even if only 50 children of those 5,000 were affected by vaccines, 1% of that group, it would be easily picked up in a retrospective epidemiological study. So these studies are quite powerful. The second argument that's made is that epidemiological studies don't prove anything. They frankly are just a statistical a look at whether or not something is associated with something or not. And that's certainly true. I mean, I'll give you several examples of this. When I was a little boy and watched the TV show Superman on TV, I know none of you are old enough to remember this, but it was George Reeves, not Christopher Reeve, that was Superman. So see the older, see, everybody who's over 45 is nodding their head. And Superman flew. I mean, and it was on TV. I was 5. How could it be wrong? So I, did what Superman did, and I sort of put this towel on my back, so I thought the cape was the key to flying. And then I went in my backyard, and I put my hands in front of me and tried several times to fly as Superman did, unsuccessfully. And probably not surprising to many of you, it was unsuccessful. And that didn't prove I couldn't fly. If I had tried 1 billion times, that wouldn't have proven I couldn't fly. It would have only made it all the more statistically unlikely. Similarly, one can't prove that there aren't weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. You can only say that they're nowhere that you've looked. You can't prove that I've never been in Milwaukee. All you can do is show a series of pictures of buildings in Milwaukee where I'm not standing next to them. And the point is this really is based on the way the scientific method is set up. I mean, you can't. The scientific method is born of a hypothesis. It's the null hypothesis. In this case, for example, MMR doesn't cause autism. You can reject or not reject that hypothesis, but you can never accept it, which is to say you can never prove never. That's always true. But I can't fly. I mean, even though, I didn't prove it, I can't fly. There's actually, Brian Strom is the head of the Clinical Center for Epidemiology and Biostatistics at Penn. Maybe some of you know him. But he calls it the P word, which is to say you're never allowed to say that you've proven anything. But after you've gotten 10 epidemiological studies with the MMR vaccine or 6 with thimerosal-containing vaccines, you can say with confidence that a truth has emerged. Because you can argue it the other way. I mean, you can argue that we've never proven that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. It's just every time we do an epidemiological study looking at people who do or don't smoke, those who do smoke are at greater risk for lung cancer, and the more they smoke, the greater the risk. There's clearly a dose effect. But that doesn't prove it. The other point is and this is, I think, probably the most important, is anecdotes are tremendously emotionally powerful. Or said another way, that the box A that Andrew Wakefield essentially reported in that paper in The Lancet is a powerful box. And I'll give you examples. My wife is a private practicing pediatrician. She was working on a weekend, on a Saturday, and she was helping the nurse give vaccines. There was a 4-month-old child who was sitting on her mother's lap along the wall while she was drawing a vaccine up into a syringe. While she was doing that, this 4-month-old had a seizure. It lasted for about 5 minutes. The child went on to have a permanent seizure disorder, meaning epilepsy, and there had been a family history of seizures. If she had given that vaccine 5 minutes earlier, there is no amount of statistical data in the world that would have convinced this mother that the vaccine didn't cause autism. And that's really what's at the heart of this. My child was fine. They got a vaccine, which are given to 90% of children in this country, and then they weren't fine anymore. Vaccines are designed to prevent specific infectious diseases. They're not designed to prevent everything else that occurs in the first few years of life. And because so many children get vaccines, that has to occur, where there's going to be a temporal association between getting a vaccine and then within a few days having something, for example, like autism, develop the first symptoms. The other point is that that is made, I think, to try and at least diminish the epidemiological studies are that biological studies are the only way to really prove a hypothesis. In other words, that epidemiological studies aren't of value because they really don't get at the root causes of why one thing would cause another. That if you really want to know that, you should do studies in laboratory cells or you should do studies in laboratory animals. And I'll give you some examples. So, for example, there is a researcher at Northeastern University who has found that if you take thimerosal and you expose it to cells in a laboratory, that those cells then develop a problem with an important metabolic pathway. And he has argued, frankly, in court as well as in the court of public opinion, that this then proves that because these cells are cells of the central nervous system, well, actually they're cells of the nervous system, not the central nervous system, that if thimerosal can affect these cells of the nervous system, then in fact this provides a biological basis for why thimerosal could cause autism, and he said this to the public. Similarly, there's a researcher at Columbia University School of Medicine who has taken laboratory animals that actually have very highly inbred strain that are particularly susceptible to autoimmune diseases, given them thimerosal, and then shown that they have differences in sort of huddling behavior, and argued, see, now I have a biological basis for autism because it changes these mice. But the problem with that is that you can't show why something is a problem in laboratory animals or laboratory mice without first showing that it's a problem. And all the epidemiological studies to date have not shown that it's a problem. And it would have been nice, I think, when these researchers have taken to the airwaves, if they would have at least offered the caveat that cells in a laboratory are not the same thing as brains in people, and that mice aren't men. And I just want to go through through a couple slides why biological studies can be both falsely alarming and falsely reassuring. We have a tremendous amount of history with this. For example, when the polio vaccine was released in the mid-1950s, it was given to millions and tens of millions of children. In 1960, it was found that those vaccines actually were contaminated with a monkey virus called simian virus 40. Millions of children were injected or ultimately ingested that particular virus. And within 2 years of that discovery, I don't know if you remember this, SV40 stands for simian virus 40, that within 2 years of that discovery, SV40 became the best studied mammalian virus in the United States because there was such angst that this vaccine, the polio vaccine that contained this virus, had been given to millions of children. And one of the things that worried people so much is it's a type of virus called a polyomavirus, which when injected into hamsters clearly caused cancer. And so the thinking was that millions of children in this country had just been injected with a cancer-causing virus. But in fact, epidemiological studies done 5, 8, 15, and 30 years later showed that SV40 virus didn't cause cancer in people. Similarly, if you take adenovirus, which is a very common virus that causes upper respiratory and lower respiratory tract infections, and you inject that into hamsters, they get tumors. But people who are naturally infected with adenovirus don't get cancer. So in both of these cases, these laboratory studies were falsely alarming. Similarly, if you take formaldehyde and expose cells in a laboratory to large quantities of that particular substance, those cells can be transformed to become cancerous. But if you look at people who work with large quantities of formaldehyde, such as, for example, morticians who use it to preserve dead bodies, those people are not at greater risk for cancer. So again, there's a disconnect between what one finds in the lab and what one finds in man. On the other hand, laboratory studies can be falsely reassuring. Probably the best example of that is the Cutter incident. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have ever heard of the Cutter incident? That's good. That's more than usual. Okay, so the Cutter incident, I would argue, was probably the worst biological disaster that ever happened in this country. When Jonas Salk made his polio vaccine, 5 companies stepped forward to make it. One of them, Cutter Laboratories of Berkeley, California, a small pharmaceutical company, made it badly. And as a consequence, they were unable to really adequately reproduce Jonas Salk's technique, which was to take polio virus and completely inactivate it with formaldehyde. They failed to completely inactivate it. As a consequence, about 120,000 people, virtually all children, were injected with a vaccine that contained live, fully virulent, deadly polio virus. That caused 70,000 people in this country to develop abortive polio, about 200 to become permanently paralyzed, and 10 to be killed. I think it was one of the greatest tragedies, probably the greatest tragedy ever to occur with vaccines. Well, that vaccine was tested. It was tested in mice to make sure that it was safe, and it was tested in monkeys to make sure that it was safe. It was tested in laboratory cells to make sure that it was safe, and yet when it was released, it wasn't safe. So those laboratory studies had been falsely reassuring. Similarly, if you look at the Merck's AIDS vaccine trial, I mean, here was a vaccine that worked very well in mice, that worked very well in laboratory animals, specifically monkeys and chimps, and yet when it was tested in people, it didn't work at all. I mean, it was a disaster, that vaccine, and that if anything, it made you worse. And so I think, again, in this case, the trials that were done in monkeys and man weren't predictive. And actually, Peggy Johnson at the NIH had a great quote associated with this, with the Merck trial. She said, you know, mice lie, monkeys sometimes lie, humans never lie. And Edwin Lynette, who was the head actually of the State Virus Laboratory in California, associated with the Cutter incident, said, the only way to determine whether something causes a problem in people is to test it in people. And that's why these epidemiological studies are critical to determining whether or not vaccines are a problem with regard to autism. The other thing in this, and probably it's the most disappointing thing for me, is conflicts of interest, which is, you know, the I think weapon that's most commonly used in our time to try and suppress good science. And certainly the most common method is the ad hominem attacks, which is to say appeal to personal considerations rather than logic or reason. It's hard to watch, frankly, groups that work as hard as they do and do as good of work as they do, such as for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, be vilified when they come up with studies exonerating vaccines by you know, parent advocacy groups and by media who are willing to tell that story, because it's this, you know, the science is about, let me tell you what science isn't. What science isn't is it isn't scientists, and it isn't advisory bodies, and it isn't scientific groups, and it really isn't even a body of information. It's a way of answering a question. It's a way of approaching a problem. And these epidemiological studies are the way to answer a question, and it's hard to see that under attack. And the last point I'll make, and there's just the 2 more slides and then I'll stop, is that another way to defeat this, and it's already happened once, is you simply shift the hypothesis. So your hypothesis is that vaccines cause autism. The initial hypothesis was that MMR caused autism. That has shifted to thimerosal caused autism. Now we've seen the next shift, the third hypothesis, which is that too many vaccines too soon cause autism. And that was probably best exemplified by a recent march on Washington that was headed by Jenny McCarthy and Jim Carrey. I think it was called the Green Our Vaccine Rally. It was on June the 4th. And I don't know if you remember this, but the chant as they marched towards the Capitol was too many too soon, too many too soon. This is incredibly popular. There's actually a book that's written by a pediatrician named Robert Sears. He's the son of a very famous pediatrician named William Sears. It's called The Vaccine Book. And at the back of that book, there actually are 2 pages called Dr. Bob's Immunization Schedule. And my wife, who's in private practice pediatrics, now sees many parents who come in with these sort of 2 pages Xerox saying, I want Dr. Bob's immunization schedule, which would be funny if it wasn't, you know, so you have the CDC's immunization schedule and you have Dr. Bob's immunization schedule. And that schedule is, you know, it sort of gently says one can, you know, should space out vaccines, separate vaccines, delay or withhold vaccines, I mean, so that you can eventually get them. Well, the problem with that is that if you do it that way, what you're going to do is you're only going to increase the period of time during which children are susceptible to diseases which can potentially cause hospitalization and death. There are vaccine-preventable diseases that are still out there in large numbers, such as whooping cough, chickenpox, pneumococcus. Those are still problems in the United States. And if we delay vaccines because we fear that children are getting too many too soon, I think we only have the potential to do damage. I'll conclude by just saying why I think it is that too many vaccines too soon doesn't make a whit of biological sense. First of all, when you're in the womb, you're in a sterile environment. When you pass into the birth canal and then ultimately into the world, you're not. And very quickly, you become colonized with trillions of bacteria. Literally trillions. I'm not just trying to sound like Carl Sagan. Literally trillions of bacteria. And in fact, you have 10 to the 14th bacteria that live on the surface of your bodies. And by surface of your bodies, I mean skin, nose, throat, intestines. 10 to the 14th separate bacteria. That's 100 trillion bacteria. You actually have 10 to the 13th, which is 10 trillion cells in your body. You actually have more bacteria on the surface of your body than you have cells in your body. I mean, for parents, frankly, and it's understandable, I think when they watch 4 or 5 vaccines getting lined up at the end of the table and they're seeing their 2 or 4-month-old about to get all these shots, the feeling that that's more than they can handle is perfectly understandable. But if they really want to get scared, just take a cotton swab, swab the inside of the nose, put it on a microscope slide and look at it. It's teeming with bacteria to which you make an immune response. Because if you didn't make an immune response to colonizing bacteria, those bacteria wouldn't stay as colonizing bacteria. We see children, for example, that have essentially born with an absence of an immune system called severe combined immunodeficiency disease, who have those bacteria invade. Bacteria like staph and strep, which live on our surfaces. And children who have acquired immunodeficiency, so for example in our hospital, children who have solid organ transplants, or bone marrow transplants, or who get cancer chemotherapy, have acquired immunodeficiencies. Those are the organisms that you worry about. The second is that if you look at the immunological challenges in vaccines, actually that was sort of number 2 there, but the immunological challenges in vaccines, we get 14 vaccines today by 2 years of age, 14 different vaccines. 100 years ago, we got 1 vaccine. Do you remember what that 1 vaccine was? Smallpox vaccine, right. Well, today we get 14, and you could argue that 14 is more than 1. But I'm going to argue that 1 is actually more than 14. Because if you look at the number of immunological components, and by immunological component I mean bacterial protein or viral protein or bacterial polysaccharide, which is just the complex sugar that's used to make bacterial vaccines, if you count each one of those as an immunological component, the smallpox vaccine, which is a pox virus, the largest of the mammalian viruses, actually the only virus that can be seen by light microscopy, had 200 separate immunological components. If you add up all 14 vaccines today, there's about 150. So there's actually less in vaccines today. I mean, it's not so much the number of shots that matters as what's in those shots that matters. And so the reason that there are fewer immunological components in vaccines today is because we've had advances in things like protein purification, protein chemistry, and recombinant DNA technology that have allowed us to do that. The other thing is the capacity of the immune system. There's a researcher at Massachusetts Institute of Technology whose name was Susumu Tonegawa, who was the one who figured out how many different types of antibodies one can make. And he did that by figuring out the number of different genes that are used to make those antibodies, and he described all those different genes and postulated that a human can make between 10 to the 9th, which is a billion, to 10 to the 11th, which is 100 billion different types of antibodies every day, for which he won the Nobel Prize. And that's, I mean, it's not, I know it's not Playboy's Playmate of the Year, but it's still a prize worthy of consideration. And so I think he should be taken seriously. And so that sort of is often used as an answer for why it is that how many different vaccines we can respond to. I think that that's only part of the answer. The better, I think, answer is a more practical answer that was developed by 2 immunologists at UCal San Diego named Mel Cohn and Rod Langman, who took into consideration the fact that we don't have infinite numbers of cells in our body that can make antibodies, and you need a certain amount of an antibody to neutralize a particular protein. And they came up with I think, something called the protecton theory. It's a wonderful article, actually, in Immunological Review. It's a little dense, but it's great. And I think conservatively, one could say that based on their caveats, that one could probably respond to about 100,000 different vaccines at one time. Now, but remember, you're constantly making new B and T cells that help us make immune response. So I would say you probably could get 100,000 vaccines every day. I'm not saying you should get it. I'm just saying you could get it. And in fact, you do get it. I mean, if you look actually at what one is typically challenged with in the environment, with the dust that you inhale that's not sterile, with the food that you're eating that's not sterile, we constantly are challenged in our immune systems, and except for that apple. That apple's sterile, but I think everything else is. So I think we do respond to a tremendous immunological challenge from our environment. And vaccines, although they're very visible, I think really are a minuscule component or contributor to that challenge. So I'll stop there, and thank you, thanks, and take your questions.
there recently was a case where the body that determines whether people who have autism following a vaccine should get recompense. There was one case where they actually decided, yes, these people should get recompense. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay, could you explain to us the reason why that one case stood out from all the others they've examined, number one, and is this a bad harbinger for the future?
Yeah, repeat, sure. There's the question was about a case that recently was conceded by the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. The child's name was Hannah Poling, and the parents have sort of sought out the press, as have their lawyers, and so you hear that a lot. It's probably the most common question I get asked. Hannah Poling was initially part of the omnibus autism proceeding. She was felt to be a child who had autism, and so she was part of this basically class action lawsuit against the federal government through a program called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. That program has three parts. The first part is that one can in fact have a concession by the Department of Health and Human Services that the claim that a vaccine caused a problem is true, which is what happened to Hannah Poling. Or if it's not conceded, then it goes to the so-called vaccine court, where there's an evidentiary hearing. If the petitioner loses there, then it can go to the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. Therefore, DHH has made this concession. She was actually pulled out of the omnibus autism proceeding because, frankly, the question is whether she has autism. I mean, the problem with autism, in part, is the way that it's defined. It's a clinical diagnosis. There's not a laboratory test that says this child has autism or this child doesn't. And that clinical diagnosis includes a series of symptoms to form a syndrome. Symptoms include problems of speech or language or behavior. Children who have moderate to severe cognitive defects, thought defects, because for whatever reason, whether it's Down syndrome or Fragile X syndrome or Rett syndrome, or in this case, a mitochondrial enzyme deficiency, will superficially mimic children who have autism or autism spectrum disorder. But that's not classic autism. And I think that's why she was pulled out of that. So, for example, my wife sees patients who have Down syndrome and autism. It's not really autism. I mean, when you have moderate to severe, as we used to say, retardation, you're going to have speech or language or communication or behavioral disorders. That's really not autism. So she was defined as having mitochondrial enzyme deficiency with encephalopathy, meaning sort of brain dysfunction, that had autistic features. And that was picked up by the press and, frankly, paraded by the parents as autism. It's really not. And Julie Gerberding, in her defense, had an interview with CNN where she said two things that appeared to be contradictory. She said, yes, it's possible that vaccines can cause fever, that fever can worsen encephalopathy as it did in this child, and that she had autistic features which were worsened. But vaccines don't cause autism. And that's what she was distinguishing. She was distinguishing the definition between those two things. And also, it just is just a little, to continue the rant, I think, it's the courts are not a place to determine scientific or medical truths. They're just a place to settle disputes. But unfortunately, it gets carried or understood, frankly, not only by the public, but I think by physicians, as being some sort of medical finding. It's just not. It's not a medical finding.
But the second part of my question is this going to be a precedent that will result in thousands of settlements in the future? Do you think this was so clearly singled out as an anomalous case?
I think it was singled out as an anomalous case. If I had to predict the omnibus autism proceeding, and so I'll dare to be stupid or wrong in this, because you'll know soon enough, it's a three-part proceeding. The first is that MMR and thimerosal caused autism. The second, which is going on now, is that thimerosal caused autism. The third is going to be that MMR caused autism. I predict that certainly if you look at the evidence that was presented, the scientific evidence that was presented by the defense and the petitioners, I cannot imagine that the court would decide anything other than vaccines don't cause autism. The question is, and I think this is where the Hannah Poling case may make a difference, is will the petitioners who then don't get reimbursed or get their claims compensated in vaccine court or the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, will they then spill over into civil courts or state courts, knowing that there's just been a lot of, if you will, jury tampering, mass jury tampering by this sort of educational campaign, that this girl's autism may have been caused by vaccines. I hope not. I mean, I hope that doesn't happen. But if it does, I only hope that the pharmaceutical companies do not take one step back, because if they do, they've opened up a door that I think will never close.
Has there been someone claims that adjuvants could cause autism?
Yes, and I think that's what's so, I guess, unnerving about this. We just seem to seamlessly shift from one hypothesis to the next. And so let's say I showed you epidemiological studies that I think exonerated MMR and epidemiological studies that exonerated thimerosal. I didn't show you epidemiological studies that exonerated the too many too soon hypothesis. I only gave you what I think are reasons for why it doesn't make sense. One could do that study, and then I'm going to get to your question in a second. One could do that study by looking at hundreds of thousands of children who get vaccines and compare them to, because I don't think, you probably couldn't find a similar number that don't receive any vaccines. You'd have to take people who are homeschooled in areas where that's popular and then look at those two groups. But remembering that those two groups probably have different health-seeking behavior would not be an easy study to do. You certainly couldn't do it prospectively because that would be unethical. So I think there may be studies to answer that question down the road. Now we're sort of, I predict, and this is part of Jenny McCarthy's story, the green hour vaccines, is that vaccines contain other excipient materials or manufacturing residuals like adjuvants, which include aluminum salts. Could it be the aluminum salts that are causing? Remembering, of course, that the quantity of aluminum salts that are contained in vaccines are less than the quantity of aluminum that one is typically exposed to in the environment because aluminum is part of the Earth's surface. Sure, I think that we'll see that as a hypothesis and other hypotheses because I think the desire is to just keep this story alive, and they've been very good at that. Yeah.
Is there an autism epidemic? You presented what I think is convincing arguments and evidence, and you've also, I think, been sensitive to advocacy groups to the extent you understand why parents and others would seek out answers. But one of besides the individual cases, there's a claim that we're seeing unprecedented numbers and increases in autism. You've also hinted that it can be diagnosed. It's difficult to diagnose. Maybe we're seeing more diagnoses. But is there a documented increase in the cases?
It's a great question. I'm not an autism expert. I'm a vaccinologist, but I think probably the person who writes the best on this and is the most persuasive in this regarding data is a Montreal, Quebec, Canada physician named Eric Fonbonne, and what he's shown, I think, is that yes, we certainly are diagnosing more cases of autism, but is it a true increase, or is it that we are more aware of that disorder and also more cognizant of the fact that if that diagnosis is made, that you're more likely to get services in your community than you wouldn't have gotten otherwise? And that's his contention, and I think he backs that up. And from the other side, I think you look at this two ways also. I think that I think back to my elementary school class, and were there children there that I think now would be diagnosed with autism? Absolutely. But we just didn't call it autism. We called it different or odd or nerdy or whatever. And on the other side, on the sort of more extreme end, for example, the notion that Down's children will be classified as Downs with autism, I think what you see a dramatic decrease in is the diagnosis of mental retardation. I mean, as autism has increased, severe autism especially, the diagnosis of mental retardation has dramatically dropped. So I think it's worked on both ends. So no, I don't think there is a true increase in autism, no. But it's certainly an increase in awareness.
Internationally, is there a correlation? Has something been done internationally to look at vaccines and their relationship to autism or something? Because I imagine the U.S. people are claiming, vaccines lead to autism, but vaccines are given to millions and millions of children all across the world. Have there cases emerged in other countries that kind of disprove these ideas?
Well, that's a great question. I think, and so the question is about are there international data that have looked at this? Certainly, at least for MMR and thimerosal, many of those studies were done outside of the United States. But I think there's a book by Roy Richard Rinker called Unstrange Minds, and he's sort of an anthropologist that works at GW who has a daughter that has severe autism. And he's taken a look actually at different countries, including countries that have very low immunization rates. To try and answer the question, if you sort of use the criteria that are used in the United States and then apply it to these other countries, do you find rates similar to this country? And the answer is yes. So I do think it's That's also information. But the thing I guess that's most distressing to me in this is that there's a lot of work both in this country and internationally looking at the genetics of autism, looking at sort of which genes are associated, what proteins those genes make, how those proteins interact with each other. And there's a lot of good work actually recently out of Paris looking at the so-called synapse, which is how two brain cells communicate with each other, and specifically looking at these two proteins, this is orexin and neuroligin. You never hear about this, never, because I think this story has really been taken over by groups that oppose vaccines. I mean, if I were a parent of autism, of a child with autism, I would be angry that there is so much resources being devoted to answering this question about whether or not vaccines cause autism, which is so unlikely to bear fruit. I mean, that CDC publication in September, that was a $5.2 million study. I mean, how many more studies does one need to do to show that this isn't it? And there's so many far more promising leads, than you just never hear about them. It's unfortunate. Yeah.
This may be deviating a bit from the autism discussion, but from the vaccine point of view, I have been approached by people who have asked me about the connection between MS and vaccines, and suggested that there has been some report out of Europe, specifically between MS and hepatitis B vaccine.
Right.
Can you speak to that?
Sure. So the question is there a relationship between vaccines, specifically the hepatitis B vaccine and multiple sclerosis? Yeah, that was born of a paper that was published by actually Mike Oldstone, who's at Scripps. It was published in Science, and what he showed was that if you took one of the hepatitis B proteins, which actually wasn't the protein used in the vaccine, it's called the E antigen, the polymerase protein, and you inject it into rabbits using a mineral oil adjuvant that has whole mycobacteria, which is like tuberculosis, that you can actually get these rabbits to have something called experimental allergic encephalomyelitis, which is like an animal model for MS. That was the birth of the notion that hepatitis B vaccine could cause MS. Now think about this. First of all, it's not hepatitis B vaccine. It's a different protein. 2, it's rabbits. And 3, it's this mineral oil adjuvant, the so-called complete Freund's adjuvant. I mean, it's a leap. Not to just rabbits leap, but I mean, it's a leap, to that. And so, but this got a lot of play, and France was who really picked this up. And they were noticing that there were some people who got hepatitis B vaccine that were adolescents or young adults, because that's who it was recommended for. Well, that's when you first noticed symptoms of multiple sclerosis. They got the vaccine, they had symptoms of multiple sclerosis. This was some sort of proof, and they actually temporarily suspended their immunization program. This got a lot of play nationally. And so, as a consequence, there were 2 excellent studies, both of which were reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, looking at the relationship between hepatitis B vaccine and MS. And what those 2 studies showed clearly, and they were big studies, very well done studies, was that hepatitis B vaccine neither caused nor exacerbated symptoms of people with MS. So I think that answer is done, but it's amazing how it's still. And it's, I think it's because it's very easy to scare people, and it's very hard to reassure them. I mean, witness the sort of the Halloween candy story. That's an urban myth. Actually, no one's ever poisoned Halloween candy. No one's ever put razor blades in Halloween candy. It was just born of, and so so there's candy tampering laws. There's hospitals that will X-ray candy bags. I mean, there's high schools that will have places where you can go to trick or treat. It never happened. It's never happened, and yet try and tell people now that they can go get candy from people that made it in their own home. Just hard to unscare people. And I think that's the story here. I think it's hard to unscare. Once you've raised it, it's hard to do it. Yeah, I'll get to you in this one second.
It seems like part of the controversy over the HPV vaccine is people saying that even though it seems safe so far, it just hasn't been tested. There haven't been long enough, big enough studies showing safety in order to, if we were going to mandate it or something like that. Maybe you could just talk generally about sort of at what point we should feel comfortable giving vaccines in a really widespread way.
No, that's a great question. So it's a question about HPV vaccine and at what level one can feel comfortable starting to give it. And so the HPV vaccine contains in it strains that have the capacity to prevent the cervical cancer. HPV is the only cause of cervical cancer. There are 2 strains in it that will prevent about 70% of what causes cervical cancer. That study has that vaccine has now been in roughly 30,000 women for 5 years. The HPV cervical cancer affects about 10,000 women in the United States per year and kills about 4,000. That you know. And here's the facts: affects 10,000 and kills 4,000, and affects hundreds of thousands or kills hundreds of thousands in the world. You now have a vaccine which uses a technology that's been around for 25 years, the same way we make the hepatitis B vaccine, and that we know protects essentially 100% of the strains that are in it and 70% of all cervical cancer that's been in 30,000 women for 5 years. Would you give it to your daughter? Of course. I mean, I think that's enough information to answer that question. Can one wait till it's in 100,000 women for 10 years? 500,000 women for 15 years? Sure, you can wait. But while you're waiting, you know that there's a real risk that your adolescent is going to grow up and have sex and be at risk. And if you have sex and you have a cervix, you're at risk. I mean, my daughter's 13 and she has been fully vaccinated against HPV. Now, as it turns out, she's never going to have sex. I mean, she promised me that. But she's unique in that. Other people's children are going to have sex. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment. When I was in graduate school many, many, many years ago, we heard a very convincing lecture from a man whose name I believe was Comet. And he told us that autism was caused by what he called refrigerator mothers. That is to say, mothers who were very cold and often didn't like to hold their children, didn't like to cuddle their children, didn't interact with them a lot. And he had data to show this. And furthermore, he said that was why we saw autism more frequently in Jewish children, because Jewish mothers, contrary to the myth that they are smothering and overprotective and never let go of their children, according to him, Jewish mothers were typical refrigerator mothers. And this was at a serious graduate school in a highly respected program from a respected researcher.
Right. And so yes. So the notion that it was actually born of a Viennese Jewish psychiatrist named Bruno Bettelheim, who was actually a Holocaust survivor, who first coined the term actually refrigerator mother. And he wrote a book about it called The Empty Fortress. This was very popular in the 1970s. He made the rounds of shows like the Dick Cavett Show, where he put this, and the Today Show, where he put it forward. If you look at his data, which were generated out of Chicago in a school called the Orthogenic School, they were made up. I mean, it was completely wrong. And I think, unfortunately, doctors suffered that because, doctors were seen as blaming mothers for autism, which clearly was wrong. And it harkens back to a time when doctors used to blame mothers for Down syndrome, saying that it was associated with drinking during pregnancy, which was also wrong. So it's right. So yes, I've heard of it. There's nothing to it. It was a sad chapter, I think, in autism. Yes.
Do you think, like, over the course of the last 50, 60 years, we have the Tuskegee trials, and do you think there's a general mistrust of the scientific community at large, and what can be done to amend this disparity between what the scientists are doing, what people working at the CDC or the NIH are doing from the common public? Should there be more funds allocated towards increasing the education or the interaction between the sciences and the people working on, disease, looking at diseases and the general public? Because if there was some kind of connection, there wouldn't be a large forum for misinformation to go around.
Yes. I mean, I certainly think that science offers us a tremendous amount and has. I mean, I think the record of what science has produced for us in terms of our health is phenomenal. Vaccines alone probably have been almost singly responsible for a 30-year increase in our lifespan between 1900 and 2000. It's amazing what science has done for us. I think we are not very scientifically literate, and so one would hope that we would increase scientific literacy at the educational level in high schools and elementary schools. I think people don't understand the scientific method. I think that it's okay to distrust scientists. That doesn't bother me. What bothers me is a distrust of science. Just such a lack of understanding of science. I mean, Jenny McCarthy, for example, not to pick on Jenny McCarthy, but Jenny McCarthy was on Oprah, and at one point Oprah said, "But the CDC has said that all the studies show that vaccines don't cause autism, and that's what the science shows us." And she said, "I have my science, and his name is Evan, and he's at home." And that's not what science is. I mean, science is a process by which one answers a question, and it's given us a lot of information. And what's so wonderful about science that I think people have trouble holding on to is that it's fluid. I mean, so for example, there was a paper published in 1981 by Brian McMahon in the New England Journal of Medicine, whereby he claimed that excess coffee drinking caused pancreatic cancer. This got a lot of play, actually. He was a Harvard epidemiologist. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Great school, great journal. It was wrong. Absolutely wrong. No one could reproduce that. And so that causes some people to think science can't be trusted. Not true. That's exactly what's trustworthy about science, which is that it's enormously self-correcting. I mean, you can have a hypothesis where you show data that are shown to be incorrect or shown to be correct. I mean, it'll either stand or it won't. And that's what I think is so great about it. But it's often seen the other way, that you can't trust it and that you should rather trust those people who are absolutely sure. I mean, Andrew Wakefield was ultimately kicked out of England, and he's come to this country, which is much more amenable to his kind of quackery. And he has thoughtful house now. He's in Austin, Texas, and he's like a religious person. He has a cure. He has a known cause. He has a known cure for autism, and people flock to him because they love the certainty of that. But you should be suspicious of that.
From a policy standpoint, what do we do for the parents that aren't getting their kids vaccinated? I mean, we can talk about what's going on in England and talk about your kids getting the measles and other diseases that in my lifetime haven't been a big deal. But these parents listen to other parents. They don't listen to the CDC. They don't listen to the law. What do policymakers do?
Well, I'll give you my personal experience in this. At our Vaccine Education Center, we periodically have these meetings with groups of parents who have chosen to delay or withhold vaccines. I mean, so it's a select group. What I find in talking to them is the following. There's about 15% of those, and these are parents who are choosing not to vaccinate their children, that believe there's a conspiracy to sell vaccines, that I'm part of it, that it's all this sort of conspiracy between pharmaceutical companies and doctors and public health officials. I find there is no convincing them. On the other hand, we aim at that 85% that are influenced by them. And what I find is that they are, for the most part, reassured by the science. I mean, I think you have to present science in a compelling way, in an easy to understand way, and at some level to have an emotional frame to it, just as you said. I mean, we're now seeing measles outbreaks in a country that hadn't seen measles. We've had 80 children at least that have had measles outbreaks. Virtually all those children have been immunized. 1 out of every 5 have been hospitalized. That's a problem. And it's because people are choosing not to vaccinate their children. I mean, all I can say is hopefully the policymakers will see that, and do, I think, see this as a problem and realize that they too have to participate in what I think is a massive educational campaign to support good science. Did that help?
Kind of a shot in the dark. What do you think does cause autism?
I think autism, there's autisms, is my sense of it. That there's not really just one thing. I think there's a spectrum of disease that may have sort of a spectrum of I don't think there's ever going to be a clear single cause. I do think there's clearly a genetic, it's not what I think. I mean, the data clearly show there's a genetic component to it. Unfortunately, it's not a single gene, like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell disease. It's going to be multiple genes and the way that those genes interact. I think that there may be an environmental component, but by environmental component, what I mean is anything other than genetics. So other things that can occur in the womb, other things that occurs after one's out of the womb. But I think when people hear the word environment, though, they always think toxin, and that's not what I mean. So I think it's going to be complex. I think it's going to be decades in the figuring out. I think even if we really nail down the genetics, I don't think that necessarily is going to equal any kind of cure. So I think it's going to be hard. But I do think it's a spectrum of disorder that probably will have, to some extent, a spectrum of etiologies. It won't be easy. It's either that or it's vaccines. That's much easier.
You guys spoke earlier, and I know there has been a lot of talk about the number of vaccines that have become available, and now we are seeing measles and smallpox, and or not smallpox, but chickenpox. Have we have any kind of tracking data on when these children go into adulthood? Will they need boosters for these vaccines? Because we're having a whole subset of the population that have never before had the chickenpox. Do we have any evidence that their immunity will wane as they transition into adulthood?
Do you mean children who've neither had the chickenpox nor the chickenpox vaccine?
Children who have had the chickenpox vaccine. Do we have any evidence that would wane as they transition to adulthood?
That's a very good question, not an easy one to answer. And so what we found is that when we introduced the chickenpox, we'll use chickenpox as an example. When we introduced the chickenpox vaccine in 1995, there were about 4 million cases a year of chickenpox. With the introduction of that vaccine, it got down to about 400,000. So we had a 90% decrease. But we couldn't get below that. And the reason is because the vaccine actually wasn't perfect at it was great at preventing moderate to severe disease, but it was about 80% effective against mild disease, and although the disease was mild, you were still contagious. So that we got stuck. So hence this 2-dose recommendation. I think with that, now you're going to get protection against mild disease probably going to be in the mid 90% range. Now I think we'll go from 400,000 down to in the low 1,000 range. We can do that. But then the question becomes, okay, so now you're immune to chickenpox. But you know, if you eliminate chickenpox from the United States, you no longer are having arguably the natural boosting that comes with circulating natural or so-called wild-type virus. Will that matter? I don't think so. I mean, because it didn't for others. I mean, we've essentially eliminated measles from this country. We've certainly dramatically reduced mumps. We have eliminated rubella. And you haven't seen those diseases come back. So, and still those diseases are common enough in the world. And I think those diseases probably enter the country because of international travel enough where you would have seen it. So I don't think so.
I'm going to throw one more hypothesis into the mix. Have you read anything about television viewing causing autism? Like
That's what causes autism. I'm sorry, I should have said that.
Like the brain development. I don't know if you read.
You know, I'd seen that. Yeah, I think, you know, it's and you know, the older father, and as associated with these sort of spontaneous mutations that may be associated with that. I think these are all interesting and probably it may offer sort of some small look at what is part of, I think, what's going to be a big spectrum of causes. But I think, you know, what we love, you know, we generally are reductionist thinkers. So we love that sort of single explanation, witness the vaccine, autism controversy. But I think it's not going to be that. May that be part of it? Yes, I think that could well be part of it. In which case my children are screwed, given what the really was that. Okay, thank you. Thanks for your time.